given how poorly the Conservatives are rating on the economy, I think it's inevitable that Labour will press on that particular bruise. If you look at the fundamentals, they are against the Conservatives at the moment, and I guess the hope must be that that they will get better. The economy may recover slightly by then. Inflation, he hopes, will be even further down than it is already. It does give him some time, or the NHS time, perhaps, to make inroads into those very long waiting lists as well. And then, of course, he might be able to get a flight off to Rwanda and claim that he's making progress on stopping the boats. So I would have thought that given all that, and given the fact that, like any prime minister, he doesn't really want to go and lose unless he absolutely has to, he will hang on.
How wise is it, though, to fight an election on the economy, which is what we expect, the largely will dominate? I mean, I'll come back to talk about immigration because I think that is very important. But how wise is it for either side, Tories or Labour, to fight an election on the economy?
Well, to be honest, I don't think parties have very much choice because that is the most important issue as far as voters are concerned. It's possible that you can use other issues perhaps to distract voters slightly, but in the end, they're going to come down to that. I'm not saying that it's the economy stupid because, as you've already suggested, there are other issues in play. But when we have a cost of living crisis, when we have a situation where people's real wages are only just beginning to rise, but where household incomes, it looks anyway, aren't going to be any higher in real terms by the end of this year than they were, probably back in 2008, some people are suggesting. I just don't think there is a way of either party avoiding that. And given how poorly the Conservatives are rating on the economy, I think it's inevitable that Labour will press on that particular bruise.
Tim, we're hearing complaints from both within the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats that the leadership is not ambitious enough, that doesn't have a firm agenda. And the Liberal Democrats are saying, where's the equivalent of Paddy Ashdown's penny on taxation? But if you can look back at previous elections as well, in the present circumstances, does it matter that the Liberal Democrats and Labour aren't offering much different in electoral terms?
Well, I think the relationship between the two is interesting. I think you certainly found, for example, at the last election, that people were unwilling to vote Liberal Democrat, partly because they worried that it might allow Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party through. Now that Keir Starmer doesn't really present much of a threat to those voters, I think many of them will be prepared to vote tactically for the Liberal Democrats, or indeed sometimes for Labour, in order to be able to get the Conservatives out. Now, if you go back to the 2019 election, the Liberal Democrats had a very obvious signature policy there. They were going to do something about Brexit. This time, they don't want to do that and are concentrating really on attacking the government. And there is plenty to attack, let's be honest. I think as far as the Liberal Democrats are concerned, they're much less concerned about vote share than they are about seat share. It's possible that, as some argue, John Curtis has argued this, that, were they to go harder on Brexit, they could increase their vote share by maybe up to 5%. But as far as they're concerned, even if they're polling 10% or just under 10%, if they're competitive in those so-called blue wall seats against some Conservative MPs, then they'll be happy with that. I think they are looking at sort of 20 to 30 seats in the end.
And what about the whole question of lack of big policy offers from either of the opposition parties? Is that going to matter?
Well, I think you've already seen this week, and it's something you discussed, Keir Starmer making a bid perhaps for a slightly more hopeful vision for society. And Labour would argue that actually they have got plenty of policies. It's just that people aren't necessarily paying attention to them right now. But that cliche, governments lose elections, oppositions don't win them, I think is probably operative this time around. We have got a government that, by any measure on almost every issue is quite a long way behind the opposition. Why, if you are the opposition, are you going to give hostages to fortune by coming out with policies that can be ripped to shreds or pinched by the government? And you're not certainly going to do that, months outside of an election.
One of the issues that will likely come up, not just the economy, is immigration. We expect the Rwanda bill legislation to come back before Parliament, although not likely next week. How big an important issue do you think that will be for motivating people to vote one way or another?
Well, I certainly don't think it's the magic bullet that some on the hard right of the Conservative Party think it is. I mean, clearly for some voters who are particularly concerned, it will be a big factor in their electoral calculus, if you like. But for most voters, although immigration has assumed slightly greater importance over the last year or so, it's just nowhere near as important as the economy, and particularly, obviously, the cost of living, or indeed the state of the NHS. Now, it's possible, of course, that it could mobilise voters that the Conservative Party needs to get back, part of that coalition that they created in 2019. But on the other hand, I think the problem with immigration for the Conservatives is they seem to be over-promising and under-delivering. And the more that they put immigration, if you like, up in the mix, the more it reminds voters that, in fact, they've not made a great success of this policy. And that's why it was, I think, unwise for Rishi Sunak to promise to stop the boats rather than perhaps say to make progress on that particular issue. So I think immigration, as always, is a bit of a double-edged sword for the Conservatives.